Good morning, everyone. My name's Kathleen Drum, and I'm the Industry Director at TIFF, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 2018 Canada's Top 10 Industry Forum, beginning with Breakfast at TIFF. We have a great lineup of speakers programmed throughout the day, which have been thoughtfully curated with you in mind, our Toronto community, by our gifted programmer, Lynn Crocker. Thanks, Lynn, and thank you everyone for coming along today. You are also very, very welcome. To begin, I'd like to take a moment to honour the original keepers of this land by acknowledging the Mississaugas of New Credit, the Haudenosaunee and the Huron-Wendat. Thank you so much for hosting us today and for hosting us year-round. I would also like to acknowledge the generosity of our sponsors and supporters who make everything that TIFF does possible. Our lead sponsor, Bell, our major sponsors, RBC, L'Oréal Paris and Visa, and our major industry supporters, the Ontario Media Development Corporation and Telefilm Canada. We're very excited to start today with this Breakfast at TIFF session, and as everyone here in the room knows, we're taking a deep dive into ethical challenges for film programmers and for media in a post-Weinstein #MeToo era. This is a big, important subject which we will be live streaming to audiences at home. So we're asking, can you ever truly separate the art from the artist? And while art should speak for itself, in practice, it's not that simple. Context, more than ever, is essential. And as we enter a new age of censorship, how will decisions be made about who's okay and who's not, and on what basis? Furthermore, should we be sidelining the work of many dedicated cast and crew because of one transgressor? One thing is for sure, there are more questions than answers, which makes for a complex minefield to be negotiated. And while most have the luxury of thinking about all of this in the abstract, for some of us, not just our panellists, but I see many people here in the room, this is a daily preoccupation. So I can't wait to hear what our panellists have to say, and please do tweet and post your thoughts using #BreakfastAtTIFF. Leading us through this conversation is moderator Neil McPherson, who will introduce the panellists. Neil has worked in the film, festival and exhibition sector since the late 90s, for the Edinburgh International Film Festival, for Sundance, the BFI London Film Festival and BFI Southbank, where he programs screenings, events and retrospectives. Neil has worked for the Irish Film Institute and since relocating to Toronto, has held industry programming positions at both Hot Docs and TIFF. Please welcome Neil McPherson.
Thank you, Kathleen. And welcome to this Breakfast at TIFF event as part of Canada's Top 10 Industry Forum. So how do programmers address the work of producers, directors and actors who have committed acts of sexual harassment and abuse? As Kathy mentioned, over the course of the discussion, we hope to examine both the challenges facing programmers in the wake of the sexual abuse and harassment cases that have come to light, as well as, I hope, looking at some of the opportunities available to programmers to support the movement that is taking place. We have a great panel with me. I'm going to introduce them all briefly. I'd like to start at the end here with Jenna Dufton. Jenna Dufton is the Programming Manager at the Inside Out and the Director of Programming at Out East, Atlantic Canada's queer film festival, which she co-founded in 2011. She has programmed for the Atlantic Film Festival, Viewfinders Film Festival for Youth, and WIFT Atlantic's Women Making Waves Conference. She has held the position as Senior Programming Staffer at both Toronto and Ottawa's Inside Out festivals since 2015. Thanks for being here, Jenna. And Barry Hertz. Barry Hertz is the Deputy Arts Editor and Film Editor for the Globe and Mail. He previously served as Executive Producer for the National Post and was Manager and Writer at Maclean's before that. His arts and culture writing has also been featured in several other Canadian publications. His favourite film franchise is the Fast and the Furious series, apparently. And apparently he makes no apologies for that fact. Sarah Ty Black. Sarah Ty-Black is a film programmer, arts worker, and writer living and working in Toronto. She currently programs a monthly series at the Royal Cinema called Black Gold, which aims to highlight the best and most vibrant of black cinema and black screen icons. Her writing is being published by TIFF's The Review Association, Broken Pencils, and Buddies in Bad Times. She's committed to intersectional feminist practices within the arts, and her work focuses heavily on the representation and experiences of black, queer, and body-positive communities. She holds a bachelor's degree in art history and cinema studies from the University of Toronto. And to my right is Brad Dean. Brad Dean is Senior Manager of the TIFF Cinematheque and part of its programming team, which selects and presents world cinema, classics and contemporary art house films year-round at TIFF Bell Lightbox. Over the past 9 years, he has curated numerous retrospectives, including Masks and Faces, the films of John Cassavetes, Fathers and Daughters, the films of Mia Hansen-Love, Strange Paradise, the cinema of Jim Jarmusch, Objects of Desire, the cinema of Claire Denis, and Divertimentos, the films of Matias Pinheiro. Since 2012, Brad has led the curation of the TIFF Cinematheque programme at the Toronto International Film Festival, showcasing recent restorations and preserved archival prints from Canadian and international cinema. He has served on juries for several local film festivals, and in 2013, he sat on the jury for Best Short Film Discovery Award at the 52nd edition of La Semaine de la Critique, a competitive section of the Cannes Film Festival. Welcome, our panellists. Now, I'd like to kick things off with something of a general question. And why don't we just start at the end with Jenna? As programmers, and in your case, Barry, as a writer, what do you feel your responsibility to the audience is?
I think we have a huge responsibility to the audience. So much today where people get their ideas from are the things that they're seeing in media and in culture. And as programmers, we're the front line of people who are putting that work out there. I personally feel a huge responsibility. And part of why I think I was brought on at Inside Out is representing, the LGBTQ community in a way that is political and that is forward-thinking. And I absolutely feel that responsibility and think that it's one of the most important parts of my job as a programmer.
And Barry, as a writer on film subjects?
Yeah, I think it's kind of the second line after the programmer stage. I mean, the programmers and the curators and people who put the things actually in the theater are the ones who are making those decisions, and then it's the job of the writers and editors in the media to further that cause and to further highlight and spotlight and critique those decisions. So, the reader is basically kind of funneled through those two channels, and I think that, we have an immense responsibility. I mean, our customer is our reader. That's who we're working for. We're not working for ourselves. We're not even necessarily working for the industry. We're working for the readers and the consumers. So that's top priority for me.
Sarah?
More specifically for me in the context of programming Black Gold, which is obviously based on representation, I feel a responsibility to my audience, of course, which I'm a part of. I think it's really important in that specific context for me to be able to examine any kind of unconscious bias I might have, examine how I can be a better ally to people in my community who I might not share experiences with. It's really important for me to be able to both take up space and to give over space and to advocate for both myself and other people. And I just think that's a really important part of programming, especially when we're aligned in this kind of representational politics kind of way. I think it's really exciting to kind of have that responsibility because, having that voice to be able to navigate and present artworks with a critical eye and, navigate them within our changing cultural climates is really important. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very important, actually, is a programmer has control, but the important thing for a programmer is always to remember to let up that control sometimes and give that over to other people, right? It's not just about a programmer dominating the conversation or the representation of what we're showing. The Cinematheque, we present the history of world cinema, which is a very complicated subject, right? Going all the way back to the beginning, we've been dealing with a lot of these issues of representation on screen. And at the Cinematheque, our mission really is to provide context for that. And we have a huge responsibility for what we show, how we show it, and why we show it.
Perhaps you could expand upon that subject a little bit and talk a little bit about some of the considerations you have to take when programming films which are either contentious because of the subject matter, the theme, if it's a very old film potentially, or the director or the filmmakers?
Is this for me
For
or
yourself,
for?
yeah. Initially.
Sorry, it's.
What are the considerations you find yourself taking when?
I mean, they're so specific according to whatever we're showing, right? I mean, a big one for us too is probably the history of cinema is dominated by a canon, right? A canon of filmmakers. I think one of our big responsibilities now is also to question that on an ongoing basis. It's why are these people in the canon? Can we change that canon over time? But it's about culture, right? Culture is always changing itself too. So we have to move with culture. We have to change with culture and consider that if we want to, be relevant, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. And again, perhaps over to you, Jenna. So when you're looking at film, at what point do you find yourself considering the subject matter? Would you, for example, if you're screening work for consideration for the festival, would there be at that point, would you rule out potential material, or would you watch everything and then make the decision after it?
I think there are things I would rule out right off the bat. Like, I wouldn't personally be moving forward with anything by Bryan Singer. That to me is just a no, and you move on. There are other people that need that opportunity and that representation more than he does. I think there are things that end up being a conversation, and I think that's the most important thing. People are diverse. They have different thoughts and feelings. Putting something up on the screen doesn't necessarily mean that you feel the same way or you promote what they're saying. So I think it is a big part of the job, too, is finding ways to create conversation around what you're showing to make sure that there is a full understanding of what's being shown and what's being talked about.
Yeah. I do want to jump into kind of one of the big questions, which is the concept of separating the art from the artist. So maybe, Sarah Ty, we could go to you for this one first. I do want to address this to everybody. So, I mean, much of what we're talking about is this concept of being able to separate the art from the artist. I mean, simple question, do you think it's possible to do so?
I think that it's necessary. I think that in our current climate, people that are still advocating for this, I've totally said it wrong.
Not a problem.
We can't. It's necessary that we don't separate the art from the artist. Oh my god. Who am I? So sorry. I think it's very much, at this point in time, we're better than that. We shouldn't be continuing these kind of traditionalist and very masculinist values that kind of, exalt these, creative male geniuses. At the expense of other people. I think that there is, as Jenna was saying, there's so many people in line. There is not a dearth of talent or, vibrant communities. And, it's just when this question comes up and people are so adamant and give such critical cover to predators, essentially, it really makes me wonder why we are essentially saying that great art is worth the suffering of others and the exploitation of others' labors in their lives. And, is it really that great if that's what we need to do to get there?
Mm-hmm.
So sorry for the confusion.
and perhaps, Barry, you could contribute to this question.
Yeah, I'm of a similar mind. The two are one and the same. But, I think that you can still examine those works of art, and it's necessary to examine those works of art in the context of the person or people that create them. So you can't... you don't want to flush away the art and just pretend it doesn't exist, but instead use that and use the artist's background and history and maybe the torment that they put people through to examine what was actually produced. So basically not letting these people just kind of off the hook and fade into history. So they're one and the same. The movie's one and the same. Let's talk about a Woody Allen film in the context of his behavior and also what's on screen, because the two are inextricably linked.
And in terms of talking about it and having a dialogue about it through writing, are you also referring to showing his work in the cinema?
I think if you show it in the cinema, then you need to have that dialogue as well. Before and after would be ideal, because you can't just... I think in terms of those kinds of works, it borders on irresponsible to just show it and then walk away. I think that you need to show it, and you need to examine it, and you need to dissect it for what it is, and then you can have a conversation about it. And I think everybody comes out of it that much more enriched and that much more, walking into a better future in terms of both the creative aspect of it and the industry aspect of it.
Okay, and Jill.
I definitely disagree with that way of thinking. I think part of the problem is as long as we keep showing and watching Woody Allen movies, he keeps making movies. And that, to me, is a huge issue. And it's like, especially in terms of thinking about separating the art from the artist, Woody Allen doesn't separate himself from his art. It's right there in the things that he's creating. And that's an issue, because when we show it in a way that's supporting it, whether we're having a conversation around it or not. And I think this, again, goes back to what Sarah has said and what I have said about opportunities for other people. As long as Woody Allen is creating film and taking up that space, there's someone who has been othered and who hasn't been given the opportunity to represent themselves that isn't getting that shot. So I personally I haven't seen a Woody Allen movie in years. I never will again. And I just don't think that it's necessary to see them. I don't think it's important. The art in no way is more important than women and people who have been abused.
Of course, yeah.
Oh, yeah, I agree. I don't think, I just like to clarify, I don't think that we should be promoting necessarily new works of Woody Allen, but I'm just talking, retrospective and not necessarily burying those films forever and pretending that they don't exist. I agree we should not be giving predators second chances and second spotlights. Like, for instance, when Harvey Weinstein decides to produce a new film, which I think is probably inevitable in 10, 20 years. Same with Louis C.K. or Kevin Spacey. I don't think these people are exactly going to hide away in the shadows forever. Is that we don't treat that as a comeback narrative, and that we don't give them a welcome back rollout mat and say, oh, okay, and now let's re-examine your work. I think those people had their shot. Let's let them leave them in history, but not, if the chance for examining their past work comes up, we shouldn't just walk away from that. But yes, I'm saying let's make sure that there's more space for other voices, for raw, different emerging voices, diverse voices that have been shut out because these men and these predators were dominating the field beforehand.
I'll just to follow up on that, I'm curious as to why one moral standard would apply to the films they might make in the future, but the same moral standard wouldn't apply to the films they've already made.
Well, I think that they're already made. I mean, we shouldn't forget that they exist, and we shouldn't let those lessons that we learn from those mistakes fade into history. Like, we should still talk about them. If we don't examine how those things got made and why they got made and all the people who protected them along the way and how all the ideas that we ignored when we were first talking about them, then we're doomed to repeat it, kind of thing. So, but that, again, they had their shot. They have their canon that already exists, so that's it. And if they want to do more work, if they can find the supporters, go ahead, but that doesn't mean that we have to promote it or we have to really, give it any kind of airtime.
Can I say?
You may.
I appreciate the idea, but I think that it's really, we don't necessarily have to watch Manhattan to have a critical dialogue about it. We don't have to watch Manhattan to hear the voices of people who have been traumatized by him. And the kind of, I get what you're getting at, but there's already so much trouble with the canon itself. It's not just about getting fresh perspectives and new voices in the now. It's kind of, recuperating our lost histories. And there's so many communities who have lost histories in film that we could be spending our time on instead of, watching Annie Hall.
Oh, yeah, I completely agree as well. I'm not saying let's all go back and watch Manhattan right now. I'm just saying if we're going
let's watch it right now.
Let's I'm just saying if we're going down a path of having a conversation about that and having a conversation about how Manhattan existed or how Woody Allen got to be the way he is, or how we got to the situation we are, then we should also make sure that we know the film that we're talking about as well.
Yeah, why was it once so acceptable in our culture, and that no one raised these things at the time, or barely did, like a lot of films. And this is going back, and it's not just the creator too, it's the subject matters that we've seen throughout the history of cinema. You go back and watch John Ford's The Searchers, and that was fine at the time. And and formally it's a very interesting film, but it's also super racist. Why was this acceptable at a time, and then how has that changed? And we always have to keep thinking about these things. It's always moving, and we can't just sit here, and it's not a static thing. We always have to keep considering these things. But I agree, we also can't forget that we did these, and we're all part of that. We all were part of accepting this at some point. But we can change that in the future. And I agree with you guys. Like it's about changing that in the future and what we can do now, and it will continue to change. And we can't forget those things happened either. I think that's important, to not forget that happened.
I read something recently about, again, going back to this concept of separating the art from the artist, which I found interesting, and I'd be curious to know your thoughts, which was this term has been in existence for a while. But the point that was being made in the piece I read was that it provides audiences, critics, writers, with a very easy out. They can just, without having to analyse things too greatly, without having to deal with the bigger questions, without having to look at themselves in some senses, they can say, well, he's a horrible person, he did these evil things, he's a criminal, he's this and that, I love this film. And they can easily justify to themselves and separate those two aspects. I'm just wondering what your take on that concept is, if that's something you think is true, or is it something which is maybe, or can you be distinct? Can you completely separate the two?
I'd like to just say people do all the time.
Yeah.
It's such a subjective thing. Like I've asked people about this since, especially since a lot of issues have really come to the forefront lately. I've asked a lot of different people, what is your take on this? And I'm surprised sometimes at what people are willing to accept, and then others are not. And there's no real consensus on it, which is the troubling part. We all have different levels of tolerance or things that set us off, but again, it's why we always have to be confronting ourselves as viewers and the audience, right? The audience is as important as the programmer or the filmmaker, right? It's an engagement. It's between all of us, and we all have to think about these things all of the time. We shouldn't be passive film goers. We have to sit there and confront what we're looking at. We have to confront the subject matter, the form. Form is a key one, and it gets ignored a lot of the time. But these are really important things when we're watching a film, that we have to engage and think about what we're watching all the time.
Going back to the concept of showing work, and if it's contextualized, obviously as it should be. But one of the things which there's obviously a lot of talking points on these issues. One of the ones which I particularly find interesting and kind of troubling, I suppose, is to what extent is the programmer complicit in protecting the artistic legacy of the filmmaker or the actor, so that their legacy is going to be that of a flawed but successful filmmaker who made good films, as opposed to a horrible sexual predator and criminal. How do we address that fact, that their legacy is not going to be about their work, it's going to be about them? Anyone?
I don't know. I feel a lot about the word legacy. I feel the word legacy is a word in a history that has not involved a lot of people. I feel like the moment that we're having right now with like the resurgence of this conversation, separating the art and the artist, it's because a lot of our cultural gatekeepers, who happen to be not marginalized peoples, are having this kind of cognitive dissonance that marginalized people have had since the beginning of film. It's this, how to identify with this, but also know that there's something here that is either devaluing myself or devaluing someone else. And I think, I think that's really why this is coming up again. Not that it's not important, but, in terms of preserving the legacy, I don't know. I feel like that's actively not what I do. I'm just saying.
Any other thoughts on that?
I totally agree with that. It's funny to hear you say that, because I often say that about the word legacy. It's just something I never think about. I'm never thinking about my legacy or the legacy of others. And I think I think maybe that is like something that maybe men think about more than women. I don't know. I'm sure there are women who their legacy is very important to them. I am not one of those. And also the legacy of abusive men is not important to me at all. As soon as you have abused a woman or have, these allegations against you, it's your legacy as an artist means nothing to me. And I think that as a programmer, then I don't feel complicit in it at all. I don't think, and maybe others do. I don't know. I would be interested to hear that if you do.
Well, for me, it's not about legacy necessarily. It's about history, right? It's about what is the history of cinema, who are these people that we're showcasing, and then what context are we putting them in, and always looking back at that, and that changes and evolves, as I've said, over time. So, there's no need to protect it if it is what it is, right? And we can go back and do different, for example, like we did, Jesse went to, when he's here, did a screening last year in Top 10, I think, of The Searchers with Zacharias Canuck, and they did like a live commentary discussing a lot of the issues with that. That's something you can do, so that changes. So it's up to us as programmers, I think, to look at those histories and see how complicated they're. Legacy is, I think it's a bit, maybe to me, I feel like it's a bit more about ego, and I don't really care about that either. So it's about reconsidering and always being open to reconsider your own ideas. Someone actually who I met at the Cinematheque many years ago was the film critic Robin Wood. And he used to sit in front of me all the time. And one of the things I really admired about Robin is he was always willing to go back on his own opinions on the films and the filmmakers that he loved. And I thought that was amazing, and until late in life, too. I mean, he was just so curious all the time and so open to reconsidering. And here's the guy who did some of the first major writing on Hitchcock, So that's something that stayed with me always, that you can always go back and reconsider those people you once admired. And, as you get older, life gets more disappointing, right? You just realize it's not really what you thought it was. So,
Yeah, I agree. Same. I feel like what we're kind of like coming up against now is, as all of these issues and our histories, just gets thrown back in our face, rightfully so. We're coming more and more to terms with the fact that cinema and film is a business. We're here at TIFF Industry. We're not here at TIFF, I like this movie. There's money involved here. We're actively giving money to people. And it really just comes down to the fact of the matter. It's like, this is a workplace. If you can't act appropriately, you should not have a job. And that job that you've previously had should not be promoted, I don't know. So.
Talking about money, another obvious aspect of showing the work of, be it Polanski or Woody Allen or whomever, is we are not only directly but also indirectly putting money in their pockets. How do you feel in terms of how would you justify doing that, with even showing film in whatever context? But the fact is, if you were to show Bugsy, Tovac's going to get some money. And if you were to show a Woody Allen film, obviously he's going to get money. But the indirect aspect of that is perhaps that if it's okay to show it, even within a certain context, externally you're still promoting their work to a certain extent, you're still encouraging other people to potentially view it on whatever platform they might be viewing it on, and maybe also other art houses, other cinematheques. So you can look at one cinema, whether it's the BFI, whether it's this one, and say, well, they've shown it, we should show it too. So it kind of creates a knock-on effect, all of which is generating income for the perpetrator of certain crimes. How do you justify that aspect of showing the work?
I wouldn't justify it, which probably doesn't surprise anyone to hear me say that. I think a concept that's really interesting to me lately is voting with your wallet, which is huge. It's our biggest tool that we have. And I believe that both professionally and personally, thinking about the movies that we buy tickets for, thinking about the films that we're paying screening fees for, thinking about how we're contributing to society and culture in that way, I think is very key. And I every time I spend money on something now, I think about what it means and what it's going toward, and I think that's very important.
And even be careful on airlines, because they're now tracking what you're watching. They didn't used to, so don't watch the crap on there. Watch the stuff that you really want to watch, so even if you're tired.
I mean, I feel, sorry.
Sorry, no, go
I
ahead,
feel
go
like
ahead.
that, yeah, that's just a really good point. And I feel like, again, in coming to head with this issue now, it's kind of been democratized, not totally, obviously, or we wouldn't be having this conversation in the first place. But, you know, that voting with your wallet, and also, you know, depending on, we all have a certain privilege depending on what kind of programming background you come from. Obviously, we all come from different backgrounds, but, you know, there's something to be said for doing that kind of anti-voting with your wallet in a festival programming setting, because it really sends a message. Like, at a repertory cinema, I can choose not to program something, but, you know, it's not big bucks, you know. It's an independent theater. It's not really going to make or break someone's day. I wouldn't make a choice depending on that anyway. But, you know, there's something, and I'm not qualified to have this conversation really, but there's something really interesting going on in festival programming, and I'm interested to see how it plays out, especially in terms of, you know, how money is concerned with cinema.
To turn that same argument on its head a little bit, obviously someone like Harvey Weinstein was involved in hundreds of films over the course of his career, many of which were directed by women, had female storylines, many of which starred women who in turn have come out and accused him of sexual harassment. How would you not show, I mean, in terms of Weinstein specifically, would you rule out showing any work that he was attached to in any way? And if so, how does that not, do the other people attached to that who had no direct connection to his crimes, do they suffer, are they collateral damage? How do you address that issue if you're not showing the work from, not just him, but Woody Allen or whatever?
I mean, I showed Jackie Brown right as the Weinstein stuff broke, which was, you know, I mean, whatever. I would do it again. I think it's all about, you know, critical context. And Harvey Weinstein is such an omnipresent figure that, you know, this isn't me making a case for separating the art from the artist, but rather valuing the contributions of other people who have worked on this film, which is not to be pro-Tarantino, of course, but Pam Grier, Samuel L. Jackson, Chris Tucker, for the context of, you know, my programming, which, you know, seeks to highlight like black icons. I'm not going to let Harvey Weinstein take away my chance to celebrate Pam Grier. Yeah. And I think it's, you know, that's not to say I didn't put it in critical context. You know, I think it's, you know, if you don't do that, you might as well not show anything. But yeah, I did it. Everyone booed Harvey Weinstein's name when we were on the credits.
I think that's it, though. It's about putting it in context, right? Because there's certain things. Yeah, what about the contributions of actors or other people who worked on these films? But it's about what context are you putting it, how are you positioning it? So I don't think anyone would want to do a Harvey Weinstein retrospective, that's for sure. So.
I think that's highly unlikely. And Jenna, did you have any input in that?
Exactly the same. I mean, we showed Carol this Christmas, and it's the exact same thing. You know, it's the work of queer folks, and we all booed Harvey Weinstein's name, and you know, you get yours, and then. But I do think that's a very complicated and larger conversation.
Barry, in terms of, again, I mean, in terms of what you write about, the films you choose to review, obviously you're in a position where you're not necessarily choosing what is being released, but you have a responsibility to review stuff. How do you address reviewing work which has been a Woody Allen film or a Polanski film or whatever? How do you contextualize anything within the review, or do you approach it very on a more distant level?
I'm in the mind of context is key. I don't think you can approach it without approaching who made it and how it was made throughout the system. That's how I approach my reviews, and that's how I try to shape the reviews that run in the section. Because if you just look at it at a work of art as just like something that magically existed and was thrown up on a screen, you're not really looking at it. Because every decision is there because there was a person that made that decision, and why did they make that decision, and how did they get into position to make those decisions. So it's critical.
Well, how about which films that you guys are choosing to review? Because there is a dominance of like studio-dominated product, and you guys tend to review that much more, give it more prominence, right? Like, what's the likelihood of a small independent film getting, you know, the cover of the art section versus like, you know, a bigger studio film?
Yeah, well, it's all about balancing what I think responsibility of the section is versus what the readers are also craving. So if there are projects that come along that I feel are smaller, that they wouldn't necessarily, our Globe readership wouldn't be tuned into or have any idea existed at all, and I think are worthy of that kind of spotlight, I try to give it as big a push as possible. But, the reality is that, people want to know about that big Hollywood product that is coming. But I truly, I do think that our section we try to cover everything that comes out in the weekend. It's often impossible because of the release calendar and the resources that we're given, but I do feel very strongly about that.
But do you feel the need to help shape and change the culture too?
Yeah. I mean, in terms of shaping, I don't know if I can necessarily do that as well, because the things that come out are the things that come out, and I don't have a say in what is given on my plate that I can choose from. But once that stuff is on my plate, I do want to make sure, and I do try to seriously give it a very critical and thoughtful and insightful look as to what we can highlight and what we can throw a spotlight under that wouldn't necessarily get it otherwise. And we do try to that to the best of our ability. It's a challenge, because not only is the film world is its own challenge and the print media world is its own particular challenge, but I do try to strike a balance wherever I can and whenever I can.
Great. I do want to give the audience a decent amount of time to ask some questions as well. A couple more questions from me though. At what point, obviously a lot of the stories that have come out over the past 4 months started with smaller rumours and they've escalated. At what point as programmers would you feel the need to, if you're showing something, contextualise it in some way? If you're making the decision to look at a film, at what point throughout the process of hearing about somebody doing something? So for example, James Franco's this week, following the Golden Globes, a lot of people have come out and said he was sexually inappropriate, he did this, he did that. You were talking about adding people to your list earlier, Jenna. Was he already on the list?
He's added to my list.
So I guess the question is, where during that kind of timeline would the decision you'd make be to avoid his work or anybody's work? That's the question.
I mean, I'm in the habit of believing women. So, I mean, as soon as there's an allegation, I think that for me is kind of the line. Statistically, it makes sense to believe women. I don't know why there's this culture of not. And I think also a big part of this is that if the judicial system wasn't failing women so intensely and hasn't been for so long, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. So for me, it's, there's allegations against you, and like that's kind of that for me. And, yeah.
Any other thoughts?
Same as Jenna. I think a lot of this conversation that's revolving around who we shouldn't and shouldn't believe is really not analyzing, these situations in terms of the power dynamics. I think that whisper networks have been a thing since the beginning of time and will continue to be, maybe not, hopefully, a thing. So, yeah, I'm of the same mind. As soon as I hear something, I believe it because, I know myself being a marginalized person, that is how I would also communicate that, you don't necessarily always have the power to go to the press or, to have people believe you, first of all, to have people value, your own experience enough that it would be believed in the face of a great artist who, why would he do that ever,
Before we go to the audience, I do want to finish this part of the event with a question, again for everyone, and for Barry in the context as a writer, which is, do you feel as a programmer you do have the power to contribute to the positive changes that are currently happening? And how do you utilize that power? Maybe we just start off with Jenna and we can go then.
I think that, I have such a small platform, but I think even on that platform, I have the ability to impact it equally negatively and positively, and that's something that I think about all the time. I like to think that I impact it positively. But it goes into, that kind of thinking goes into every decision that I make. for sure.
And Barry, as a writer.
Yeah, I mean, as a writer and editor, it's huge. It's about putting things into context, and it's about putting a spotlight on voices that would otherwise be unheard or marginalized or drowned out by the larger Hollywood machine.
Similar to Jenna again, just having this is the whole thing. Same as Jenna, yeah. Just having a small platform. I'm obviously not, drunk on power or anything, but I am trying to, make any kind of change that I'm able to with the resources I'm able to. Community engagement is really important to me. I think that's, an accessible level of engagement of change that I can enact myself. And I think, we should all be asking ourselves these questions, because you can enact the change at every level. It's just a matter of how able you are to do it, how many resources you have to do it, big or small. I think, these all add up. The reason we're here in the first place is because, we heard whispers and rumors, it all starts from a little thing. You just got to pull it. So.
Yeah, I think you always have to be asking yourself what you're doing and ask yourself, why are you doing it? And then take responsibility for what you're showing.
So we've got some time for some audience questions. There are microphones being circulated, so please do wait to get a mic before you start talking. So if you'd like to raise your hands if you'd have a question for any of the panelists. Yes, person over here. Yeah, thank you.
I feel like I was forgetting my question as the microphone was coming towards me. Sometimes I feel, I'm going to share a perspective, and there is a question in this, because I know it's terrible when people just say a statement and don't actually ask the panelists a question. I'm struck by the fact that this is a conversation that is indicative of a much larger problem. Like it's a much larger societal problem, and it's something that is present within our systems, within male-dominated systems, and while it's like the hot topic right now, the film industry is kind of rife with this. So while we have a couple of key names that stand out, and I think the thing I'm grappling with is that the panel ends up focusing on them. We're still giving them a spotlight. So all the names that I've heard today are only the perpetrators, not, and some really great solutions and perspectives that I was like, yes, I wanted to keep on applauding. But I think I have two questions, because in a sense, we've chosen an industry that, like Cameron Bailey said at the Toronto Film Critics Award, is sick. And it has been for a really long time because of power dynamics. So it isn't just about the wine scenes and no. So I guess my question, and I'm sorry I did not formulate this in a clear, succinct way, is around how do we actually start bringing forward voices of people who are doing great work, who are examples of like ethical filmmakers, and not just people who they don't talk about it, they're being like the perfect stranger, they don't say anything, and that somehow makes them a good filmmaker because they're managing to hide their dirty business. But I'd love it if this conversation in the future could you speak to, well, what does it actually look like if you want to promote ethical programming? What is that? Like, who are those filmmakers who are examples of this work, who are, who you can stand behind and really get behind this as the champions for change? So that's my question. And also, how do we put forward the voices of these victims who constantly go silenced and unheard? Random question for whoever wants to take it.
Okay. I was thinking about this a lot too, because I think, it's obviously we're in a watershed time, and we have the spotlight on us to see like what the first steps will be. But I think it's important to realize that, every system we have is broken. We need to start from the ground up. Like Jenna was talking about the judicial system. This isn't something that is just film. This is us societally at large. And, as Cameron said, it's a sickness. It infects every level of our lives. It's not just, can you make a film ethically, program it ethically? What happens when you go home? Do you pay the people who work for you at home correctly? Things like that. And I don't have an answer for it. I just know that, I think we should be trying our best to listen to other voices because that seems to have the most effect, centering those that aren't being heard. And as to how we will do that more, I don't know. The onus is on the people talking to make space. So I don't have a good answer for that. Maybe someone else does.
And the onus is on the audience, too, to support that work, too. I mean, that's a major thing, too. So get out and support that work.
I think what you're talking about is exactly what I would consider my job to be. So I would like to think that if you come to Inside Out, you're hearing the voices of those people, and we are giving those people a platform. I think I'm try to be very thoughtful about who we're giving a chance to speak. So I do think it is about, going out there and going to those festivals and looking for that work. I would hope that becomes more of a widespread thing. And I think as programmers, I'm here because someone gave me the opportunity. And for me, it's making sure that I'm giving the opportunity to people who I know are going to be doing the same thing, so that hopefully it's growing exponentially.
Any other questions? Raise your hand. Anybody? Oh, down the front here. Thank you.
Yeah, there was quite a bit of talk about breaking the canon, changing the canon. I suspect boutique, smaller festivals by default are already breaking the canon. My question is really for the two guys up on stage, as more mainstream programmers, large venue programmers, writers, what is your responsibility? How do you affect this kind of change of the canon, breaking of the canon? The moderator talked a bit about, there's a shorthand, there's an easy shorthand for celebrating the canon. What do you guys do about that?
I mean, if you look back at the history of the Cinematheque programming, I think we've done a pretty good job of that. If you look at all the filmmakers we've showcased, we try to balance that. And we continue to keep pushing ourselves to do that more and more. And everyone should keep pushing us, too, to do that more and more. So I think we've done it. I don't want to start listing off the series we've done. I mean, I think that would be redundant. But I think if you look back at our history, we've done quite a bit, and we will keep challenging that. It's about space. I wouldn't say commercial in any way. If anyone who knows me, I'm not at all commercial. So large venue, yes, but not commercial. So we just have to keep doing that. But it's also about space, and it's about sharing the space or giving up your space and not defending it. I think historically, especially in Cinematheque programming, there's this attitude with the old school Cinematheque programmers of really defending their space, and it was like their program and their idea, and you couldn't go against that. I don't really come from that generation at all. So for me, I'm always looking for a conversation with people. I'll give one example, I guess. I did a history of Iranian cinema here, and I know some things about it. I'm not an expert in any way, right? So what could I do then? I was in the position to be the programmer and organizer of all of this, but I'm not an authority on it in any way, So what I did was I went out and tried to find as many different guests from different areas to come in and provide context for the series. People I agree with, people I disagree with, it doesn't matter. It's about having a conversation and engaging and opening that up while looking at the history of that cinema. So it's not about, as a programmer, being the authority or controlling it or anything like that. So I think you have to think about different ways of opening it up or giving your space up.
Yeah, and on the kind of publishing end of it, it is kind of a similar thing about giving that space up and giving that space up for the larger movies that you kind of expect would get the coverage for the smaller movies. And, we're not perfect. It's a challenge. It takes work. You have to put in the work to look for those underrepresented voices, and you have to make the work to convince somebody to give those people the space, and the onus is ultimately on me, and it's a constant challenge and balancing act. And there's no easy solution, but I'd like to think that I'm putting in the work and I'm making some inroads where I can, but it takes time and it takes effort.
There's a question, yes. Yours.
The focus of the discussion has been largely on sex and the industry. And I totally understand that because it's highly topical at this point in time when it comes to ethics and programming. Could I just broaden the discussion a little bit and ask the panel about some of the other issues? Of course, political points of view of the individual artist, their politics, and of course it's a wide range of politics, from their specific politics to their views of race, of gender, of environment, et cetera, et cetera. So as programmers, how do you extend the notion of ethical programming beyond simply the sexual? Of course, it's very easy to identify a sexual harasser. They're being called out all the time. How do these other ethical issues, I guess, around your own belief system affect the decisions you make as programmers?
I mean, I think we get really kind of strung up in this argument between, kind of more liberalism or conservatism and radicalism. And really, at the end of the day, it's just basic respect and decency. And it's easy to get bogged down by, how we politically believe. But, I'm obviously not going to program a film directed by a neo-Nazi. But, we just, again, critical context, as we've been talking about, I think that is, on paper, like just as important, because at the end of the day, no matter your belief system, how that enacts itself in, your making of a film, of your role in an industry, how you treat other people, are you treating other people with respect, are you paying them the same, are you, just all these, it's just kind of seems like, basic decency. And I hate to squirrel away from that question if someone has different political beliefs, but at the end of the day, we're all just trying to live and be respected. I don't know. No one, sorry.
No, I agree with that, but I think it also becomes complicated sometimes what happens when the ideology of, say, the filmmaker as a person conflicts with actually the work that they make. What happens when those are totally different, right? So what if it's someone who's horrible who makes something that, is completely different than those beliefs? What do we do then? I don't have an answer for that either. So, but this is how complicated it is, right? But also even really knowing a lot about people too. I mean, you discover as you go along. So that's the other thing, is you always have to keep adjusting and reconsidering.
Everyone does with Nancy.
Exactly.
Jenna, did you want to speak to that as well?
Yeah, pretty much the same. But I mean, there's so many things we don't know about people. I think the things that we do know, I take very seriously, kind of across all of those areas. I'm also one person on a team, and I think that I do lean more politically than other people that I work with. But I do think that is something that is important to most programmers to understand the voices that they're choosing to amplify. Especially at an LGBTQ festival, there are so many different voices that have to be recognized and have to be given that opportunity. So I think, it's always looking at what's the most positive representation we can put out there.
Any questions? Yes, thank you.
The discussion keeps going back and forth between hearing voices that now might have a chance to get heard and showing work by a Harvey Weinstein. There is I'm hearing a dichotomy that Harvey Weinstein, as somebody just said, he's a monster. His work, however, doesn't necessarily represent his value system. So he's been responsible for giving voices to people who otherwise might be marginalized. There are films you're showing anyway, even though they're made by Harvey Weinstein. So how do you, when do you stop showing a movie that was produced by somebody that you happen to know has committed some kind of indiscretion, how do you judge whether the person who made that movie has committed an indiscretion, and you're seeing the result of that on the screen, or it's influencing the art? Where do you draw the line? I'm mixed up listening.
So where do you draw the line in terms of dealing with certain people's work?
I think we all have to decide for ourselves what that line is. I think it's different for everyone, probably. Harvey Weinstein is particularly complicated. He's this umbrella with a bunch of people under him. I mean, to never watch Carol again and to erase the work of Todd Haynes and Christine Vachon, who are amazing queer filmmakers, like, I don't know. Maybe the answer is it's all gone now. For some people, maybe it is. I personally, for myself, still struggle with what the answer to that is. I don't know, but I think we do all have to decide for ourselves what that line is.
Yeah, I think it's also particularly complicated when you're coming from programming positions where the goal is to have a representation of a marginalized group on screen, because we're essentially working from scraps. This is how the history of film has been. Marginalized people see versions of ourselves, and even if it's not made in the way that is, the most ethical, that's what we have. And I don't think. Hopefully we'll get to a point where we don't need those anymore. I feel very conflicted about this, but in terms of my own programming, Black icons and Black iconography is such an important part of screen culture that, as Jenna said, it's a case-by-case basis, but in the case of Weinstein, as I said, he's so omnipresent that I'm not willing to throw away that cultural value, and we don't have a lot to start with in the beginning.
If you want to be really confused too, I think you're showing Portrait of Jason
coming up. Oh my gosh.
And there is a film that will completely confuse you even more. It's an amazing work, but so complicated to grapple with as you're watching it. So go see that screening.
That's next Friday, incidentally, at the Royal. We've probably got time for one more question. So, okay, an online question.
Yeah, we have a question from our online audience. This is Jessica May Matheson, and first off, she says thank you. I would like to hear any thoughts on what the panelists think, believe, hope the industry will be like in a year's time. I think that one of the biggest fears is that this topic and force of change will die down and things will go back to normal. But it seems like there's enough support to continue the progress of change. How will these discussions affect change in the future, both within the next year and the years to come?
You'd like to address that first?
Well, I think in a year's time, it'll still, unfortunately, pretty much look the same. I think this dialogue will still, it will all be a matter of keeping up the dialogue and keeping up the conversation and making sure that we don't forget about it and that the hashtags don't kind of fade from memory a year from now at the Golden Globes or the Academy Awards. And that's going to be a difficult thing because it's a very easy conversation to have right now because all of these monsters have kind of been exposed, and that gives us an easy way to continue to start the dialogue and continue it. Continuing it actually will be the challenge. Once maybe allegations die down and once we kind of get to a bit more of a steady ground, okay, what's the way forward? And a year from now seems like a very short amount of time to make any significant change, so it'll all be an uphill battle.
I agree with that. I think also, not that this dialogue is important, but there's a difference between talking on a panel about this and, enacting real world change. I think it's going to be about what real world resources we put out there to help people who have been in this position. How can we kind of stabilize the system so the power shifts from, abusers to the people who have been abused? Because that's really what's going to change it at the end of the day. It's not going to be conversations, not to undermine the importance of this, but, it's what tangible, real life resources and initiatives can we enact to, make the change that we want to see in the world. I'm so sorry.
I'm afraid that is time up. So I just want to thank you all for being here, and I'd obviously like to thank very much each of our panelists, Jenna, Barry, Sarah Tai, and Brad. Thank you.
To everyone. I'd also like to thank our panellists for coming along and for being so candid with your view today. And thank you, Neil, too, for this morning and for also for your contribution to helping shape the whole day we have lined up today. Before I ask everybody to leave the room, which we need to do soon because we only have a 15-minute turnaround, I'd just like to add, if I may, a very quick extra response to the woman who asked about why are we still watching Harvey Weinstein films, and to really just to mention what I see as the difference between, say, a Woody Allen film and the very prolific range of Harvey Weinstein films. Woody Allen is a creator who defines his work in every way. Harvey Weinstein has been the head of a very aggressive and successful couple of US distribution companies for 2 decades. And part of the deal when a sales agent sells a film by an independent filmmaker from anywhere in the world is that to Miramax or to the Weinstein Company is that Harvey Weinstein's name is put in the front credits, whether he's had anything to do with those films or not. Okay, so 15 minutes, everybody, and then we're back in the room. Thank you so much.